Okay, good evening and welcome to the second edition of the mini webinar series covering designing games for professional military education. Today, we're taking a dive into the littoral with the United States Marine Corps. And I'm delighted to be joined by Captain Nicholas Royer, USMC, who is the designer of the game we're going to be talking about tonight, which is called Downrange. Nicholas, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background of how you came into the Marine Corps and how you got into wargaming, please.
Sure thing, Ed, and thanks for having me. So, joined the Marine Corps about 9 years ago, coming right off the heels of a career as a professional toy designer. So, I didn't think that would follow me into the Marine Corps. It definitely has with this little project. Originally assigned as a public affairs officer, spent some time out in Okinawa, Japan, with a 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force. Got selected for the Commandant's Career Level Education Board that sends Marine officers for post-secondary education. And that landed me up here in 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, where I'm the modeling and simulation officer, which in practice really translates down to mad scientist, wargamer, and general training support provider.
And is this the first wargame you've designed?
This is the first war game that is intended to be kind of standalone, pushed out to people and have them play. I've done quite a few war games for different units, not just in this assignment, but other assignments. Um, I'm a big believer in wargaming as a training tool and a tool to spark conversations. I had a big series of war games we've just wrapped up on installation, logistics, and force protection, and a lot of the lessons learned from that process went into coming up with downrange initially in Christmas time of 2023.
Cool. And have you got any sort of hobbyist wargaming background that led you into this kind of sweet spot of professional and interest space?
I wish I could say I have a rich history of wargaming. I really don't. The toy design piece obviously helps with the manufacturing, and I think there's definitely influences there. I played Dungeons and Dragons in high school because I'm a nerd. Um, I think the toy design piece really helped get my head around some wargaming best practices, not from the actual physical models, but from the perspective of customer interactions. Because I found out really quickly that what people tell you they want is usually very different than what they're actually looking for. And kind of flipping the board around on that and looking for what conversations do I want people to have has become kind of a guiding principle in coming up with this and any of the war games I've worked on. So a lot of unusual influences I think go into my process, but I really don't have too much exposure to a lot of the commercial wargaming market, unfortunately.
Mm. Well, that's an interesting point because if you've ever looked at a classic military professional war game, not a commercial one, a lot of the chrome and sort of additional stuff which would be attractive to someone on the outside is gone. And there is a sort of sad truth that you can compel people in the military to sit down and play a military war game for anything up to 8 hours a day on multiple days, and they will do it because it's orders. So therefore, a lot of the sort of feedback systems that commercial hobby games use, to give you excitement, suspense, vested interests, a bit of back and forth, they don't need to be present at all in a military system because you can just make people go. But the sad truth of it is that people will then only do that war game when they are told to do it, and not for all the other times and all the other benefits which it gets. But I mean, looking at Downrange is front cover, I can see a lot of thought has gone into the age group and the sort of MOS of the audience, if you want to speak to that.
So it's funny you mentioned the age group and the MOS, because I think, at least in my experience, what I've seen is that the biggest barriers to adoption for wargaming in the U.S. Marine Corps, at least, have been cultural, and a lot of that is aesthetically driven. The younger generation, the guys who are in that 18 to 25-year-old age bracket, jump on this stuff and embrace it with open arms. When I show a system like this to a colonel or a sergeant major or any of the more senior folks, their usual request is, can you make it uglier? Can you make the rules look like they're, typed in typewriter? Can you take all these little plastic tokens and replace them with cardboard chips with unit icons on them? because I think there's this perception that when you're playing with the little toy soldiers or toy Marines, as I'm sure I'm going to be beaten for not saying, um, there's that cultural bias of why are you playing with toys when you should be, out training, and something that is full of charts and graphs and little icons that looks like work, that looks like training, that's good. So I've definitely gotten some pushback in taking this aesthetic approach. Um, Usually I've found that pushback goes away very quickly when I bring the colonel, when I bring the sergeant major back into the room where those junior guys are playing it, and they're overhearing some of those conversations about, well, I need to echelon my effects like this. I need to open up with the mortars and then shift to the machine guns when I get closer. And then I need to shift fire so I don't have fratricide, and then come in with the infantry on an attack. They realize that aesthetic component is just as much a vehicle to reaching the younger guys as having something that's a little bit more Windows 98 in flavor, I always like to say, is a vehicle for reaching some of the more senior audience.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, Windows 98. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me on the surface of Close Combat Marine, which was a top-down digital system in the sense that as you look at the board, the map, and the three-dimensional stuff that you've printed is not too far off what that system was using in the 90s. And that was quite successful of its time. But then digital systems became more fixated on first-person shooters and really high-fidelity graphics. And I think the core value of that was lost for the sake of chasing pixels and everything else. So I think that's great. And you are going to get that comment about first impressions looks like toys, therefore are we infantilizing something very serious such as war and combat? But again, the common thing I keep saying is judge a war game on what it does, not as in outcomes, not what it looks like necessarily on the table. And if you've got a bunch of 18 to 23-year-olds talking tactics, that's pretty much an exception than if I walked into any certainly any base in the UK, I would find them probably moaning and griping about something or asking when they were going to knock off, but they wouldn't be talking tactics, and they wouldn't be talking about echeloning fires and machine guns. So anything that works, once you get over the hiccup of it being potentially uncool, but it's cool if we all do it together, and I think that's great.
Yeah, especially when you incentivize it with an early release on a Liberty. If you beat the other guys, you have a kind of a competitive setup for it.
Oh, yeah,
There's
yeah.
I have the biggest problem I have in playtesting this, and I do a lot of playtesting, is the models tend to disappear pretty quickly after I get in the hands of the training audience. And people will ask me for copies of the rules. And if I say, sorry, we only had this many printed copies, those will tend to walk away too, which, as frustrating as is, I think is a good sign for the willingness to engage in something like this off duty.
Yeah, that is absolutely a good sign. I didn't know anyone who left with a professional analytical military wargame piece from all my time doing them. So we're going to hit the first big question, which is what drove the requirement to design a wargame?
I noticed pretty quickly in this assignment that, speaking for my experience in the U.S. Marine Corps, and this is my experience. This isn't an official statement from on high. We have a lot of really great wargaming tools and computer-based products for the 3-star general, the 4-star general, looking at the battlefield as this web of complex effects and echelons. We have a lot of good stuff for that. And then we have a lot of really great stuff for individual skills, whether that's marksmanship, operating a vehicle, first aid. What we don't have is something that sits in the middle of it, where it's getting after that sergeant, that lieutenant, that captain who's in charge of 4 to 40 guys. We don't have a lot that they're able to use either on the system doesn't exist level, or the system exists, but you have to schedule it 4 months in advance. Everyone has to be outfitted with a virtual reality headset, and the thing is going to work maybe 7 times out of every 10 at best. So there's that accessibility gap in wargaming for the small unit leader that I wanted to fix. And coming from a toy design background, having gotten into 3D printing, I just decided to mess around a little bit. I was boredom is a great driver of innovation, I found, especially in a military setting. And I was bored over Christmas of 2023. I decided to see what can I do that might address that gap in a way that's not relying on technology that might fail in a way that's maybe a little bit more accessible to guys who just need to get a kit out and they can take it in a pouch with them when they go to the field and then play the game when they're waiting for trucks. So it's kind of a confluence, all those different factors led me to try to fill that gap.
So you did this off your own back. There was no direction from on high to do this, and I assume therefore there was no funding, at least initially.
Correct. Most of the models for all the early test kits were 3D printed at home. Um, I just came up with this. I was fortunate to have very tolerant leadership that has basically told me get results, but we don't care what you do as far as your methods go. Um, and we've been starting to slowly expand production of the models I had with some in-house 3D printers. Some units are starting to use their own 3D printers to make some of the models for this game, but the impetus initially was just seeing a gap and getting after trying to fill that without having any kind of direction from top down.
Cool. And did you have a list of aims? You've mentioned sort of the context, but as in when you were trying to then focus down on things like scale, number of pieces, time to play, did you have any sort of aims that were guiding you to lead you to those design choices?
So I try to keep three things in mind when I was designing this. And the first one is I really wanted to expose players who may have some military background or may not. I wanted to expose them to what does warfare look like in the 21st century. Um, Drawing from things we've seen in Ukraine, obviously, kind of the drone use in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. Um, I want to get people familiar with the concept of you are always being watched from overhead. There's always a threat from overhead. There's always a concern for signals intelligence, electronic warfare, and there's always a need for combined arm effects. I wanted to get something that would expose people to that in a way they can understand regardless of their background. Um, I wanted to make something that would do that and then do that in a way that doesn't require tech support, that doesn't require extensive setup, that doesn't require a separate training course to learn the rules. And I have to give some credit to Mr. Tim Barrick over at Marine Corps University with his phenomenal operational wargaming system, OWS. That is a great war game. You pretty much need an entire course to learn how to play it and a full staff to play it. And I wanted to create something on the complete opposite end of the spectrum from that. And then the big thing at the heart of it is I wanted to make something that 18 to 25-year-old young man with a craving for violence, who's the Marine Corps' prime motivator, I wanted to make something that he would be willing to play, that he'd have fun playing, and he'd want to beat his friends in and maybe learn something along the way.
Awesome. So we're going to move the slide deck on so people can see a bit more about this. I'm going to describe this visually in outline. So you've got two large MDF boards which are forming the table. You can probably find those lying around any base. There's a sort of white grid sheets which have been put together to create the map. The map has then been drawn by hand for whatever terrain scenario requirements. So in this one, it looks like we've got a USMC landing from left to right from the sea onto the land. We've got some ISO containers, possibly a storage for loading, unloading on the left. We've got a hill on the right. We've got some open space in the middle. And then on the far side of what looks like maybe some hard standing, you've got a road which bends round off. You've got a couple of sort of oil storage facilities or some kind of containers. And the greens are the US Marine Corps and the blues are the People's Liberation Marine Corps, I believe. I've got that right, Nicholas?
People's Liberation Army, Navy, Marine Corps, because apparently the West doesn't have monopoly on clunky acronyms.
Awesome. So very easy to set up. I mean, the description under the title downrange is a sandbox wargame system, which is exactly what this is. You decide what you want to do. You don't need to conform to any particular set. There's quite a lot of stuff in this picture. You don't need to have this many. You can go for a lot fewer. But also, if you have this many, we will come on to the turn mechanics, etc. You will have multiple players per side controlling their portion of the battle space, and that creates the team dynamic to discuss. And there are some cards you can see at the side which have the data to drive the rules. So all in all, this is quite. I know there's obviously some crayons in the corner because what there wouldn't be crayons if it wasn't the Marine Corps, that classic jibe. But you can then add stuff onto the map. So quite literally, you could add a berm or a gully in the middle if you wanted to explore that, or a trench system. So as a training tool, this is great. You can just add or subtract without having to change a huge cloth model or change a scenario map that's been printed in glossy and so on and so forth. But you could do that if you wanted to, and then email that around and stuff. So, Nicholas, anything I've missed on that description?
No, I think you did a pretty good job, better than I could certainly. And I do think I want to highlight though, given that this image is on graph paper, that's because it's the paper we had on hand at the time. There's no grid requirement. It's all just measurements. The goal for this is really you can play this anywhere. The oil containers in that, for example, are actually spray paint can lids. We've had a lot of units play this with actually digging the terrain out with an old school terrain model out in the field. We've had sidewalk shock on tarmac for a large scale game. The sky's really the limit. It is intended to be environment agnostic for where you're playing it, what you're playing it with.
Awesome, great design principle to take off. We're all very used to doing map models for orders and stuff, and all this is just adding another layer. So you can tick two boxes of actually practicing building a map model to a certain scale, and then doing this as well. So let's talk about some design dilemmas, choices, and trade-offs. Where could this have gone if not with what you had here in front of us?
The first trade off that I was really wrestling with was at what echelon I wanted to focus this. I did eventually come down on the side of really platoon and below. Um, and I've gotten some requests for, hey, how do I make units aggregated so I can have a battalion on battalion thing that I can play with one player on one player. Um, I think there's a lot of goodness in that. I'm considering whether I want to put together a rules supplement for a variant of the game that focuses a little bit higher echelon. But for the core game, I decided pretty early on my target audience is that squad leader who's looking for something to train his guys with and some downtime. And I tried to sacrifice anything that would get in the way of getting this game in his hands and accessible to his Marines. Um, there's a lot that I went through in terms of cutting some of the fidelity of the rules, cutting some of the detail. Um, I originally had a much more expansive set of electronic warfare capabilities represented where units could perform electronic attack, different types of jamming, different types of countermeasures. And I think there's still some DNA from that in the finished product. But I decided to really scope that down to what is the individual who's encountering this for the first time really need to know. And I decided that what they really need to know was this is a feature of the modern battlefield that's not going away. If you want to transmit, there is always a risk with that. And any capability you're using in terms of electronic warfare, operating UAS, that gives you a beneficial kinetic effect, but it also opens you up to detection. So really scoping it down to that, what does the 18-year-old on the ground need to be aware of and trying to drive it in that direction. And the other thing that is a constant tension, I think, throughout the design and refinement process is the realism of the scenario versus the feel of it, let's say. I mean, obviously, when you're looking at this map, we have vehicles clustered very close together. Any reasonable sergeant is going to look at the dispersion of those troops and tell them they need to get a lot further apart. Um, and I decided to compress the distances down. Weapons ranges are very compressed. Everything is compressed down both to fit this thing in a reasonable playing space, but also I wanted it to be a situation where people are having to make choices about maneuvering and fires. Without having essentially you run out into the open and someone 800 meters away immediately kills you, because that's very realistic. Doesn't really let people get to grips with the positioning, the geometries of fire that I need them to get familiar with for our training goals. So I tried to capture the feel of having the echelon effects, the feel of being in an environment where there's all these different factors you have to consider. I tried to capture the feel of it more than the realism of it with the rules. And I think that comes out in the aesthetics too, where some initial feedback we got, for example, was that the School of Infantry was actually getting a lot of their students familiar with Chinese vehicle platforms using this system, which was not an intended goal of it at all. But the instructors started hearing the students say, well, that's a ZBL-09 because it's got wheels, 4 wheels on a side. It doesn't look like it has the pointed prow, and the turret looks a little bit fatter. So it's probably not a ZBD, it's a ZBL. And that was one of the feedback items. I thought, you know what, that's actually a great point. Another way to squeeze some value out of the system. And a lot of the design that I've done since then has been with that secondary objective in mind. Obviously, that's particular to the models, but I think it's a good example of exaggerating some features and condensing others to serve an objective, regardless of whether that's realistic.
Yeah, and that's a great point of secondary benefits. If you had gone for a unit symbol, NATO symbol, and the example that always gets me is the mechanized infantry symbol, which means everything and nothing. In some armies, it's a BTR, and others, it's an IFE. We are increasingly adding more and more modifiers to these symbols to try and differentiate the sort of blob. And often it still requires a text note next to it saying what is the platform of reference. And in some wargame counters, the NATO symbol also has the silhouette of the vehicle, the primary vehicle, just to illustrate it one level more, which kind of makes your point. But this is great. You've also got things like facing and turret alignment, which are all good drills to do. So let me just try and highlight a few. Proof that I did once command in armor. So you've got side on profile here to direct fire shots. So that's a great learning point. Your turret and your glasses plate tend to want to be pointing in the same way. You've got a peekaboo shot going on here. Like there's a way to do that well around the terrain feature. You've got a lot of dismounted potential clearances angles here, and the fact that you've got individual troopers means you can actually talk about squad and fire team formations. So you've got a wedge going on here coming out the surf. That'll look great on camera. This formation, for example, would be good to react to the flanks, maybe into the front in a smaller sense, but not able to bring all of its fire to bear. So these are great points, because having just a counter can often assume that the squad leader is in the best formation possible. And as you go up the levels, as you said, that is to be assumed, because you don't want to be micromanaging fire teams as a battalion commander. But this is exactly where the training lessons can be derived. And on the hill here, we've seen what looks like a close quarters battle, casualties, and this formation is now clustered and disrupted and is not able to necessarily do what it needs to do on the far side, and could potentially be picked apart or hit with IDF. And these are all just like surface level examples that I've spent absolutely no time preparing for in advance. And you, Nicholas, as someone who's closer to this level of war than me, could probably bring out a load of more. But I'm sort of highlighting these to say that just having the counter symbols at this scale would probably not necessarily give us some of these great talking points.
Exactly. And I think there's the tactile element that really benefits engagement too, where I know I've seen people do this. If you're a platoon that's coming in to do a squad on squad, force on force exercise with this system, you're able to give that individual rifleman a little token, and it's not this icon on a map includes you in it. It's this little man on the table is you. When it's time for you to move, you are going to go up that hill and act, and no one gets to tell you what to do. You're going to act in the last orders you received. And that feeling of embodiment in the game world, so to speak, is a good driver for engagement, I found. Not to mention, it's more visually appealing. One of the biggest things actually that I try to think of when I design stuff like this is someone who is not familiar with the rules should be able to look at the war game and describe the situation accurately. Maybe not in terms of mechanics, but they can tell what's going on. And I think that just helps with the comprehension. It helps abstract away some of the record keeping and the bookkeeping that a lot of war games go into. You should be able to tell what's going on from a snapshot has really been a guiding theme that I try to keep in the back of my head through this whole process. And I think you just provide an excellent illustration for that. So thank you.
Yeah, and if you are a private or lance corporal sort of level, you see the battlefield in this manner, not as in that from this third dimensional top down, but you see a vehicle firing at another vehicle around a hill. You see people strewn on the battlefield, friendly and enemy intermingled. You see people stacked up in cover. You don't see an icon That's certainly maybe a company commander's view if you've got a integrated C2 tablet kind of system. A lot of armies still don't have that. So you're using your eyes to look forward and then you're relating that to a map and you might update your map with icons. But generally speaking, you see this. So therefore, seeing this and creating that pattern recognition, is this platoon or troop, is this in an assault or is this preparing to assault or is it just waiting to move around a corner based on what the vehicle disposition is? Are the back doors open? Are troops, and does it look like I could give them an order to do something now, or do they need time to reorganize themselves? And so is that a squad that's pinned, or is that a squad that's providing effective fires on the enemy? If they're all cowering behind an ISO container, you get the answer. You can tell. If it's just a counter, again, you can sort of assume your plan is going the way you want it to go, and it might not necessarily be that way. We have got a slide on drones coming up, but you can see some in the middle here zooming around. So that was obviously a conscious decision. But was there any threat of scope creep in this regard, given what's going on in Ukraine?
There is always the threat of scope creep with any of these projects. I've really tried to control that and clamp down on it. And coming from so I actually got my degree in computer science, and one of the things I always try to think of with this is I think there's the Windows philosophy of software design of make one thing that does everything, and sometimes it does it well, sometimes it doesn't. And I think there's the Linux philosophy of do one thing very well and make that thing interoperable with other things. And I've really tried to steer into the latter of focusing this on the very, very lowest echelons, tactical level only what that private, that Lance Corp on the ground needs to know and needs to care about. And then focusing on effects of the mechanics rather than the mechanics of themselves is a big thing for me. If there are two mechanics that I play test and I notice they're producing the same type of behavior, like for observation for indirect fires and using automatic weapons used to have different mechanics for suppression. I noticed it was creating the same behavior regardless of the mechanic. So I just wiped that all out and replaced it with a single suppression mechanic. It's really that play testing and trying to keep these themes in the back of my head going through. That's been my primary tool to control that scope creep. But you're right, it absolutely always is a threat.
Yeah, I was sort of wondering if off-map effects was also creeping in at all. So we can see the HIMARS here. Now that could be, this scenario is not great for that example because you've got probably a ship with a similar long-range fire system, but that could be off the map and you could be calling in fires in the manner that you describe. But then you can get into a lot of the other things like attack aviation, close air support and stuff, which I think you can model just in an abstract way. But before too long, you've created a multi-domain platoon level wargame, which might detract from the level at which you've already stated you had focus on.
So there are ways that I've seen training audiences playing this come up with ways to represent some of those off-map effects. The most common one that I'm looking at formalizing is things like naval gunfire, air-delivered fires, and again, that the guy in the ground basically just needs to know this is a magic explosion generator on a point that I designate. So one of the rules I'm looking at for that, for example, is if you have observation on a point, you have a certain number of on-call sorties or fire missions, and you have to maintain observation for 2 turns before you put that chip down, and that's the explosion on the ground. That's the EW effect you're calling in. And that's to force you to consider the observation and the need to expose yourself and continue to communicate to adjust those fires, which again brings that right back down to what does a guy on the ground need to know of if I want some of these effects to happen, I have to accept a certain level of risk in exposing myself both visually and electronically.
Cool. Great point. So going into page 1 of the rulebook, or page 4 of the rulebook, the introduction. So you've done this sort of what it is, what it isn't, which I think is another great way to explain it. It's a bit of your design philosophy going into this, and you've just hit it in 4 bullet points. And we've talked about it in our discussion thus far, so I won't won't reiterate, but you've also said what it's not, which I think is often something design rules don't have. They say, this is my war game. They don't often then flip in a positive sense. They don't often flip to the negative and say, this is what it's not. Because some people just can't get that. If you say this is about platoon level, some people go, yeah, great, it's the battalion war game. And you're like, no, I'm explicitly stating it is not this, or it is not designed to do this, and this, like urban doesn't work in the rural, or whatever, sort of thing, or it's not meant to simulate, mass casualty situations with a high degree of medical accuracy.
Yeah, there's always the case when I'll play test and someone says, "Hey, can you make this into?" We actually had a request for a mass casualty drills. We did actually end up accommodating that, but it was at the triage level and more focused on the tactile actions for CASVAC and medevac away from the point of injury. And I beat the Navy doctor in submission metaphorically of we're not including more medical fidelity in the rule set than we already have, because we could easily make a medical war game. I'd be happy to make a medical war game for you specifically, but that's not what downrange is. Downrange really is, again, focus at that tactical level. And I find some people sometimes need a gentle reminder. Sometimes they really want it in writing of, hey, this is what the system does, but this is what you can't rely on it for. And that's kind of the space where I usually hand people off to another wargaming system or another product that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, and there's a real temptation, less so in your case because you weren't directed to do it, but a lot of sponsor organizations will say, I'm paying for this, so I'm going to go broad as possible, cover off battle group wargame system. The initial scope was, platoon to brigade. And, they had to narrow that down because effectively you were going to have a game that did platoon badly and brigade badly. So he said, we're going to make it about the battle group with good level of company detail, platoon level aggregation and counters, but you aren't seeing how the platoon's operating. That is assumed to be going well. So, again, your point here notwithstanding. And you've got a similar paragraph that I've seen in other systems, such as I call it the golden rule. You haven't called it the golden rule, but you have the phrase, when in doubt, the intent is always to allow players freedom of action. And I love your point saying that possible and smart are not synonymous. So just consider, just because you can do it doesn't mean it would necessarily be a good thing to do tactically. And hopefully the game system will punish and reward accordingly.
That's always a tension that I have with some of the war games I have with senior audiences, where I'll always hear, "Oh, we can't do this. We can't combine these two unit types into another. We can't take this certain type of action." And I always have to, be very frank with them and say, "No, you absolutely can. And if the situation is desperate enough, someone absolutely will do that thing in an attempt to gain an advantage." And we need to, and this is, I think, more broadly within the defense space, people often confuse doctrinally correct with possible, and those are absolutely not the same things. If someone can do it, they will. Examples that I've seen in real life is, people say, "Oh, you can't fire a javelin off a small rubber boat, or you can't fire a javelin off a moving, small utility vehicle." And I have to remind them that it may not be a smart idea to do that. It may not be the doctrinally correct way of employing that weapon system, but you absolutely can fire javelin off the rib or off the UTV. And we need to account for those possibilities in our professional education, in our training, in our wargaming, because people are going to do it. At the end of the day, you put someone in combat, they're going to do anything it takes to gain an advantage over their enemy. And that may not be what is doctrinally correct. Unfortunately, it may not be what's an intelligent move, but they are going to do that. And we have to prepare for that possibility.
Yes, and we should be inculcating that mindset in the schoolhouse and in the barrack room rather than for the first time on operations. And this is also where, for me, live fire ranges don't allow that space because of all the safety, the very sensible, and people have died to get those safety measures where they are. So I'm not discounting them, but I'm often a bit I'm not sold on when someone says live fire training is the be all and end all because it's live, so it's real. And it's like, well, no one's firing back at you. You're not actually practicing a lot of the messy maneuver. It's often quite scripted, and you never have anyone behind you because that would be unsafe. But that's going back to this. If you were to range template this, This is an absolute travesty. Unsafe flagging all over the place. But that's the tactical action. You can't replicate that on a range. Or the only way you could replicate it is you make safe literally everyone at the back row, which is then they know they're not playing and they're not really taking it seriously. So, and that's my sort of we tangent into criticizing live fire, which I love doing and is absolutely part of a training progression. But my worry is that people will revert to the drills that they have been hammered into them rather than expanding to fill the fullest possibility, thinking outside the box. And this is also true of our adversary. If you project your own limitations on your adversary, you can be really surprised and tactically defeated. And when we were fighting an insurgent for 2 decades, they were doing that to us a lot because they were not conforming to a doctrinal model. They did not have fire teams of 4. They did not have the orders process, and they did not contest ground and fight to the death. Generally speaking, they melted away and pulled us onto their IEDs and all these things that we hadn't really cogitated until experiencing it for the first time. And we're out of that now. We're back to stuff which is a bit more defined. But in the same way, the Chinese forces that you face or the Russian Mobics are not going to adhere to the same doctrinal principles that we hold, and they might not even adhere to the doctrinal principles that they once wrote.
I think you're absolutely right, and that's something that I've actually had a conversation with senior infantry officer with on this wargaming system. Is he took exception to the fact that some of the enemy models and enemy units were depicted as just as capable as their American counterparts. I had to remind him that pride is wonderful from a cultural perspective. It's wonderful for recruiting. It does not make for being effective. And we have to assume that our adversaries are not just as capable, but I would say in some cases more capable than we are. The best case scenario, we have overestimated them and things are easier than turns out we thought they were. Worst case scenario, we're correct. And we gotta assume that the enemy overmatches our capabilities, so we're constantly striving to get after them. And I think wargaming is a great way to explore that and look at what does a superior force look like when you have to counter that. What is a force that has access to electronic warfare? What does a force look like that has access to maybe they even have air superiority? And wargaming lets us train for that in a way that you can't do on a live range necessarily. Or again, bringing it back down to the focus of the platoon level. If you're a squad leader who wants to have your guys get out there and train, you just may not have the guys out there to have a force on force event where you have a significant enemy force. It just might be given 4 guys, a different armband to tie on and tell them go out, run in the woods and cause havoc. That's great. That's valuable training, but it doesn't get after, I think, some of the messy realities of warfare today.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you as the designer will understand how much of a change you can make. And you don't want this to become a classified game where the sort of secret analysis of your adversary's platforms has been boiled down to rule systems, because then that is and vice versa, your own capabilities have been secret or otherwise have been boiled down too much, because that makes it more exploitable. But also using the dice analogy, which we will come on to shortly, you had for example a D8 and a D6. Okay, even if the IFV of the Chinese is less good than the US Marine Corps version, is it 2 points on the dice less good, or is it fractionally less good? And when you see a lot of operational analysis, you can see sometimes the difference between a BMP1 and a BMP2 might be 0.3 of a number of like 3. So one's 3.3 and one's 3.6. That's really hard to then relate to a D6 or a D8 or a D10 even, because it's not even moving the needle necessarily. So there's often a problem trying to do very lazy, good, bad, awful kind of triage of equipment when, as you say, it's been designed by a a regional, if not global power to fight our system. So we should assume it's capable of doing that. Otherwise, why would they make it in such quantity?
Yeah, and that's something that I've gotten requests and I've gotten some criticism for. Why do you only have one BMP model? Can I have this variant, that variant, and that variant? I have broken out some variants of platforms, but again, bringing it back down to that tactical level, if the way the guy on the ground is supposed to go about killing that platform doesn't change, then I'm probably not going to change the variant, because what I'm trying to get him to do is to recognize it and figure out how to kill it, not perform any more detailed analysis. That is a great topic for a system that is not downrange.
Okay, moving on to the heart of the system. So we talked about dice, so we'll move on to dice. So I'll briefly just explain the pictures that I've grabbed, and I'll then let you take over, Nicholas. So I said multiple players on each side. You have the term round and turn. So a player is taking turn. The once everyone has taken all of their turn, then the round is done. Other people might call that a turn, and then there's a phases. But again, apples to apples, pairs to pairs. You have an initiative roll. Very simple D10. Again, the facilitator could decide how initiative is parceled out, and it could switch. But again, a randomized method is often what we see. Key point: each thing you control, defined as a unit here, can do a movement and an action. It can't move, and it can't act. It can move or act. It can move and nothing. It can nothing and act. And any combination, as long as it's not doing any of that. Act covers everything other than move. So you very succinctly there covered off firing, calling on the radio, taking aim or focusing as you've described it here, treating an injured colleague, so on and so forth. So really simple. And again, quite binary. We call it fire and movement. So you've got a very simple choice to make. Do you want to move or do you want to act? And then what act do you want to do? And then the reaction system. So you can interweave, so you don't have that horrible situation where the I go, you go problem of where the entire squad runs around the corner and gets to annihilate the gunman lying in ambush before the gunman lying in ambush would mow down the squad, which would probably happen in live training. So again, you've considered that, which is great. You've got you've got a very simple step system to determine things like fire effect, so line of sight, range of the weapon system, and then you have a skill to roll the skill of the firer and the difficulty of the weapon. We'll come on to that. And then that's effectively to successfully engage. So it's a bit like the survivability onion, going through the survivability onion. Successful engagement, and then is the damage sufficient to overcome the defense? So that could be body armor, cover, armor plate, reactive armor, blah, blah, blah. Again, very simplified down. And for this, you use dice. You've gone for a D4, D6, D8, D10. So again, we mentioned OWS before, so this kind of borrows from that idea that the better thing you are, the more sides of a dice you roll. So a poor roll would be a 4. I think you've kind of baselined your average as a 6, and then you've got a good and a great. And then you can roll multiples of those dice as well. Nicholas.
So the other thing that I've used the dice for and I found very useful in playtesting is using the dice to abstract weapon to target matches, to where I have a rule a little bit later on the rule book that says if the damage of your weapon is, let's say, it measured in d6s, and the defense of the platform you're targeting is not a d6 or a d4, you just can't damage that thing at all. So if you've got a tank rolling around the corner that's got 4d10 defense, and all you have are weapon systems that do d8 damage, d6 damage, d4 damage, you better work on your mobility rather than attacking that thing, because you have no hope. And that, I think, forces players into more carefully considering one, how many weapons they have available. Two, is this the right weapon to match that target? And then three, a lot of the more high-end weapon systems, I have a limitation on ammunition. So if you want to waste one of your javelins on a distant IFV that may not be coming for you, you need to make that choice, because you don't have anything else that can reach out and touch it. So uh, I found, keeping with the theme of reducing record keeping, instead of trying to have a table of this is what can attack something else, it's pretty simply the roll is you got to meet or beat. But if your dice isn't at least as big as whatever you're trying to target, you just have no hope. which also cuts down on a lot of kind of lucky rolls and attempts to get lucky with the dice in a way that would be not necessarily viable in real life.
Hmm. You also have an advantage and disadvantage. So again, a lot of games have a modifier. I'm guilty of this in another game design I'm in with this. You can sort of you can accrue modifiers. So like I'm a +7 because of all these amazing, like rear shots, top down attack, all the rest of it. You've managed to simplify your advantage, disadvantage. If you just want to talk to that briefly.
Sure. So I abstract it really simply away as you either have an advantage or a disadvantage or nothing. There is no, you have two advantages. There's no, I'm at a -7. You're either going into it with being a little bit ahead, a little bit of behind, or nothing. Um, and for advantage, it's simple. You roll the dice. You roll the dice. You're trying to roll twice. And you take the better result. Disadvantage, you roll the dice twice and take the worst result. And I use advantage and disadvantage as a flexible mechanism for adjudicating a lot of effects that in other systems might get a little bit more granular. Um, and the probability really does, I think, hit the audience once they start experimenting with the advantage and disadvantage. The biggest thing I'll usually start seeing audiences use is using their automatic weapon system to suppress the enemy and force a disadvantage on them instead of actually trying to use them for firing. Which I think really helps introduce audiences to the concept of suppressive fire in a way that's pretty useful from a training perspective. But then also on the advantage side of things, they pretty quickly cotton on to the fact that having your commander there able to influence the course of things and designate a main effort to give them an advantage is a very powerful force multiplier. But in order to do that, he needs to be able to communicate. So you start thinking through where does leadership need to be in this battlefield geometry, and how are they communicating to avoid having them getting targeted. So for the training audience of say new Marine officers at the basic school, where we've shipped a couple kits, that is a critical question to their competency as a small unit leader, and it's something we can get after in this system with basically roll twice and pick once. So it's a very flexible mechanism that I'm pretty happy with how it's performing so far. And I think a lot of other questions training audiences have brought up about, well, could you include this factor and that factor? I've either kind of said it's out of scope, or I've said, okay, this is going to be an advantage or a disadvantage. Just leave it at that.
And what's the reaction been to the multiple types of dice? Because again, your average non-wargamer has generally seen the D6, may have seen a D something else from a specific hobby game system, but probably hasn't seen a game with all four used in this manner.
The reaction from the supply officer at my unit when I said I wanted to buy about 40 kilograms worth of dice was an interesting one, to say the least. Um, Overall, the biggest question is just availability. I think people really quickly understand um, the utility of the different dice in the system. But yeah, that biggest question has just been, where do I get one of these fun little 8-sided dice? Because I can't get this out of rating my children's board games at home.
Yes, the unintended negative of your wargame design is there's a lot of children crying because they can't play Monopoly. Okay, other components. We've talked about the map. We've talked a bit about the 3D the pieces, but let's unpick that a bit more of how you get to the point where they are on the map printed in 3D. So you have a file for each of these, which you designed yourself, and then these are available for people to do 3D printing on themselves, correct?
Correct. I am working on a solution to get these files more widely available. Right now, I've just been sending them to units that have a 3D printing capability, but I'm trying to get it to a point where someone can click on an interface online of, I want this unit, and that unit, and they get a file in their inbox with specifically the units they requested and nothing more. Um, each unit generally is a file, and without going into the technical details, I've really tried to look at the manufacturing side of this as demand has exploded, um, and see where I can economize on printing, because the limiting factor is not cost. I would say everything you see there is probably maybe 10 cents worth of material cost. It's a very low material cost, less than $1 for what you see out here. The printing time on a traditional 3D printer is by far the limiting factor, where a platoon will take anywhere from 4 to 24 hours to print out. So anything I can do to limit that printing time is beneficial. Good example is you look up at the images on the right of the green models with the JLTV and the MTVR truck in the background there. They're using the same turret. One, because they can use the same turret in real life, but two, I can print off a plate of 30 turrets with Mark 19 grenade launchers and 30 turrets of 50 cal machine guns, and parcel those out among many different kits instead of having to print one thing per. And again, it also has the handy bonus of giving us the turret traverse. It's very important for some of the very tactical level looks. Also lets me create variants of models pretty quickly to where, true to real life, the Chinese ZBD-05s can share the same turret with the ZBL-09 APC, and I can now print again the same thing, plate of turrets, separate them out among holes, and I now have given the players a lot more options without a lot of investment in printing from my side.
Yeah, my understanding is that you're going to send out a starter kit with, for example, the forces in the images shown here. So a unit customer can get going, and then they will be able to do their own 3D printing to build out from there. Because if they had to order it from you, you become basically a mailroom having to print and post, which then prevents you doing any R&D for more wargaming or improving the gaming system. And you become the crutch, the single point of failure for this rolling out, and it moves at the speed of you rather than, and this is not your job. You have another job which you're paid to do. So I think this is great because the two extremes that are often seen is everything's completely done for you. Here's the package, open the box, you've got everything you could ever need, go away. Or the other end is it's print and play, which sounds great from a cost, and the bean counters do run our organization, sadly. It's great from a cost perspective, but that time commitment and also just the energy and uncertainty about assembling these things, if you've never done it before, really puts people off, and it can lead to a suboptimal assembly. Things look a bit gash, and no one really wants to play it. And inevitably, someone is compelled to build the wargame parts. And so the first thing is you lose the first potential convert through the fact that they've had to spend hours of their probably free time after hours doing it to make the figurines and the vehicles for the war game that their higher up has told them to do. Whereas the alternative that you've gone for is they have enough to get going, they like the war game rules, they like the system, and then they want to add more stuff to it. But they can choose what they want to add, because again, you could have a catalog and they could go through and say, well, I'm a heavy engineer unit and I don't see my stuff there. Or I don't see a package there, so I want to do that. And again, if you've got a competent 3D modeler, it's not hard to just put a dozer on the front of some of these things if that's the sort of thing you're after.
Yeah, that's the vision ultimately. Is I'm going to try to find a solution for getting starter kits just manufactured and sent to people, but a lot of the systems that certain people might not need, or that most people might not need, I'm looking to make that more of a self-service thing where maybe the model file is available, but you're going to print it yourself because you're the only unit in the world that operates that type of equipment, and I can't print something for you when it's that low demand.
Okay, I said we do a small feature on UAS and EW. So I really like the fact that you've included this, because this is often a criticism of use of any commercial systems from the Cold War, or counter aggregate systems when individual UAS are not shown, and a lot of these effects are abstracted. So not only have you got UAS in, you have attack UAS, and you have the communications link to control them, which I think is key. Now, again, you can have fiber optic in future. This is not really a problem from the game mechanics point, but I think this is probably one of the early credibility tests that a junior audience will apply to anyone's war game. If I'm not seeing stuff from, Ukraine, Gaza, or Nagorno-Karabakh, then I'm going to be less enthused by the logic and design choices that you've made to get me to participate.
Yeah, that was a big part of the design influence, was what can we do that gets people familiar with 21st century warfare. And I think we've seen Ukraine that the role of unmanned aerial systems has really reshaped the battlefield in a lot of ways. Um, or in some ways, I think it's returned us to an era that we thought we left behind with trench warfare and pervasive fires. Um, and really, I try to again keep it simple. And you can kind of see with the radio and the interplay between the radio and electronic warfare. If you want to do anything that requires communication, you have to expose yourself, and you have to assume the enemy has the ability to detect you. Um, which is a critical point that I want to get my training audience to understand, that the players have to understand, is there are a lot of great capabilities that you can leverage. There is always a risk, and using the radio is not a free action, because it never is in real life. Even if you think you're in the clear, there's always someone who can listen in. It's just a matter of whether they want to turn their attention to you at that moment. Um, and also, one of the things I didn't come into this thinking of, but that's turned out to be something I've learned from the players, is the tactical considerations of employing first person view drones, where you need to have the operator stationary really to operate that thing, or he's in the back of a vehicle. Um, and the consideration of how do you integrate the drone operator into an attack on the move, for example, um, without making him a liability or without compromising the momentum of the maneuver force. And I've seen some very creative solutions from players on, maybe if you have a limited vehicle capacity, you put all your drone operators throughout the vehicles, and your troops who would traditionally be the dismounts in the vehicles are slogging it out on foot because it's more critical to let those FPV operators operate unhindered. Um, and you're also clustering your signatures so you're not having a Christmas tree of lights across the battlefield. You've got a couple points, and you're not adding additional risk in by having him control the vehicle remotely. I am working on some rule sets for autonomous weapon systems, which I've had quite a bit of interest in incorporating that into rules. Um, I don't think I need to get too weird with that, because at the end of the day, I'm just going to treat it as probably a substandard combatant, where if you have that drone, it has the skill capacity to home in on a target and fly itself into it, but you're not asking anything more from it. And I think as technology matures, um, unfortunately, in my view, I'm going to have to revisit that and maybe look at making some of those autonomous systems significantly more capable than a substandard combatant in the rule set.
And we are going to talk playtest and reception, but reception to these particular aspects from the team.
The reception I've gotten from the junior most folks who have tested it out is very positive. I think they're enthusiastic about what some of these capabilities can bring to the table. Also fully cognizant, I think, of the risks. In many ways, I think the younger folks I've worked with and have play tested this with pick up the idea that radio use is not a free action and it exposes you to a threat. They pick that up easier because they're not coming off of 20 years of military experience where you're facing an adversary with very limited electronic warfare capabilities. Um, I have gotten some criticism from some more senior audiences about this system doesn't let us use some of the command and control systems we might want to use. It doesn't accurately reflect our network centered warfare capabilities. And I have to remind them that's really the point. You can't use those things as a free action. Like, there's always a cost. You have to consider that cost. The other thing I've gotten with perhaps a little bit more senior audiences in playtesting this is, I don't want to say denial, but I think there is a bit of a sobering moment that I've seen some players have when they realize that um, enough UAS on the battlefield can really negate a lot of material and training advantages that your force might have. Or at the very least, you have to think very hard and very outside of what your usual doctrine is to counter that. Um, and I think it's a positive that the system leads people to have those moments, like you say, before it's actually out on the battlefield. Um, but that I do see that kind of emotional reaction of coming to grips with what this means, because you're that major who just had your force wiped out by a lance corporal who was using drones, and you didn't think through your countermeasures. You were broadcasting everywhere, and the game that was scheduled to go for 2 hours is wrapped up in 20 minutes.
Yeah, that's yeah, and that's a sobering experience, and the sort of thing you should learn before you're a major and doing it in the field. I mean, I would say the critique to the senior officer's comment is that the unit which is signaling is the one that's emitting. Everyone else on their integrated digital system is receiving without signaling. So that at least is a fair, one person is exposing themselves to communicate, to contribute to the COP, but everyone else is able to, the common operating picture is everyone else is able to benefit from that, as opposed to potentially a relay rebro sort of system of old, and things going from squad to platoon signaling again to company signaling back, which would light up a lot more of the system. So you could argue that the network is there, but it still requires someone to actively transmit. And you haven't got this in the. Sorry, I'll let you comment on that first.
So it's interesting you mentioned that, because we've seen a lot of stuff kind of organically emerge from players and how to tackle these challenges, and we see things like players asking the facilitator, "Can I bundle up kind of a package of my transmissions? Have one guy send that out as a burst once, and then he pops down below cover and jets away in the UTV." Um, we have people asking things, "Well, can I use optical communications for long range situations where I have line of sight?" Um, we've had a lot of very creative schemes for uh, and there's no specific mechanism in the rules for using spurious transmitters as decoys, but people have pretty quickly figured out that's an effective TTP, tactic, technique, and procedure if you're playing double blind. Um, I think that some of the things you bring up, the rule set is simple enough to let people come up with ideas on how to structure their communication architecture to mitigate the risk. They don't need to be a comm expert to come up with. In fact, we had one of the players that I saw come up with a pretty reasonable architecture for scheduling transmissions, trying to package them in bursts, and using a mix of analog communication, passing messages, and radio communication. Is actually a cook. So I think this speaks to a lot of the right questions I think are being asked by the players as a result of keeping the focus in the rules very simple.
Yeah, that's a great illustration of how sometimes doctrine and process stifle imagination and innovation. And because there probably was doctrine on optical signaling that has now, the radio killed it, and now someone's like, we could do that, but they're not going to suggest it necessarily in a field exercise because we don't have that. Shut up. But in a war game, that's great. Yeah, what would it be? How much information can you send optically? Would it be a code book kind of thing that what are the 10 most important signals you could send? This sort of thing. I was going to pivot slightly, not to go drag us back to the global war on terror, but you could also simulate the use of remotely controlled or command detonated IEDs using the same methodology, with the action to initiate, either being through signal or through a command wire, using the skill ratio and all that stuff. So again, I think it's really flexible, and you can take it wherever you want it to go.
Uh, I think you're absolutely right there too, and I think it's also interesting to see players start coming up with solutions like improvised explosives when they're playing as a force that may have traditionally been fighting those types of tactics and techniques, and see them realizing that, okay, let's say that I'm all light infantry and I am fighting an enemy armored force in a built-up urban area. They start coming up with some of these ideas on their own, just given the structure of the rules. And then you see some of the older guys in the playing audience realize this is what our enemies were doing to us back in those wars, and this is why they were doing that. So it's interesting seeing that moment of realization there when you're facing an asymmetric situation, but now you're on the other side of it in a war game.
Okay, focusing on some of the simplicity aspects of the system. I mentioned there was a difficulty rating for certain actions, or for operating certain weapon systems, which you defined, but you also have this table of effectively 0 to 10, which explains the difficulty level and some examples. So should someone wish to describe doing an action or add an action to the war game, they can reference it from this scalar. And then therefore they can apply the difficulty level that is appropriate, rather than just picking one that's easy to roll. So landing a plane with no functioning engines is a 10. Is the thing that you're describing easier than that? Yes. Can it be done untrained, like unaimed fire? No. Okay, so we know it's lower than a 10, higher than a 3. Then you can pick it up there. And I think that's brilliant because that just saved you 55 annexes of all the things anyone of any MOS could possibly want to do and wants your war game to have it in. So bravo, bravo on that.
And one thing I want to touch on, and forgive me, I'm getting a little ahead of you, is I generally baseline any action that's contested at about a 4. So you have a 50-50 chance if you're a combatant of average skill from being successful. You'll notice over there on the right that, oh, that's the vehicle table, never mind. But you'll notice in some of the weapon tables, I have weapons whose difficulty greatly exceeds what an individual troop can operate. And that's a deliberate design decision to force you to have multiple folks collaborating at once to operate a weapon system. So you might not be able to perform self-surgery, but when you look at the difficulty of that task, you can start to figure out pretty quickly how many additional troops do I need to throw at this task to give you a reasonable ratio of success. So this table over here at the left not only gives you the individual difficulty, we found that it helps players kind of come to grips with how big of a team do I need to tackle this task. And especially for things like electronic warfare or some other more exquisite effects, we found them to pretty accurately reflect how many people you need to do that in reality.
Yeah, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you can attempt this on multiple turns. So that rather than having again a predefined, it will take you precisely 5 turns to change a tire or whatever. It's like, okay, you are doing the action and you may fail multiple turns and then succeed. Because again, there's a sort of thing of like certainty is, we have work tables and stuff, but in combat, the certainty thing goes out the window. So I think that's a great idea. You can't necessarily plan explicitly it's going to take this much time. Your sync matrix is nice and neat in planning, but in reality, it's all over the place. So this kind of lends itself to that idea of it'll be done when it's done. But here's the chance.
There's I think an inherent tension to this a little bit between the mechanics of the game and the narrative of the game scenario, and it's something I have to tell usually again some of the more senior folks that the mechanics are every action is attempted once in a turn and it either succeeds or it fails. In the narrative you're trying to do when you're training, that may represent a period of preparation prior to doing that. That may represent multiple attempts. That may be a burst of fire and one shot hits instead of one shot, one hit. Um, and managing that, I think the younger folks have an intuitive understanding of that dissonance between mechanics and story from playing video games. I think the older audiences I've worked with have had a little bit more coaxing to try to understand that principle that just because the surgery was attempted and succeeded in one turn does not mean it took the same amount of time in the story as firing one shot. And you have there I can't provide a rule set for everything. You have to keep what is actually going on in the back of your head, and house rule is appropriate to try to reduce that dissonance.
Yeah, so you almost become the sort of dungeon master and providing the narrative on top. And everyone loves a story, and it's much better to explain a D10 roll of X as, you've removed the body armor from the casualty, you've done your vital checks, you've done this, and you're about to insert various pieces into the casualty, and that's the end of the turn.
Yes, and I think this also lends itself very well to mixing this in other types of training. I've seen games played where, for the medical example, once you get down, you get your corpsman, your medic down to the injured guy. Okay, you toss a tourniquet at one of the players in your team. You've got 20 seconds to apply this thing, and if you do, we're going to consider automatic success. Like all of these rules are there to support your training objectives or your entertainment objectives, depending what you're playing this for. And you can replace or augment this adjudication with whatever might be effective to address the need you're playing it for. Whether that's maybe at a staff level, I want to see an actual fires plan before I'll say any fire mission is going to be effective. You name it. This is by no means a be all and end all. This is a mechanical framework to facilitate a discussion ultimately.
Yeah, that's a great point about spin-offs. Either spin-offs into other games, like for example a medical game, or spin-offs into training that you do in garrison to cover off the training delta that you expose in the war game. So, and again, I'm not advocating everyone does this for playing when they do war games, but you could say if you want to send an order from one player to another player, it's like you need to send it in voice procedure standard. Like, not having the casual conversation with the coffee that they're doing around the table. You know, you could force them to do it in a transmission no more than 20 seconds. You know, you you can also do things where if it's like you've just run up a hill and you do this, say, fine, 20 burpees and then do it. That it's as much as you want to get into the immersion. The point there is not that we should be doing burpees and war games as much as the importance of thinking whilst fatigued is the point, to bring that into line. And likewise, if you do call for a mortar fire, the round is off, you need to send an adjustment as you would do in real life. Yes, in the war game, you saying it, yeah, it's right 3 inches. But like, what is that in your, how do you send that in the procedure? So on and so forth. There's ways you can spin it off, and then you can be like, okay, we were very bad at the use of machine guns in the war game. We're going to teach the use of machine guns, and then we're going to do some live fire exercises with machine guns, because just doing it in the war game doesn't mean we necessarily have it haptically. So we're going to do that, but we weren't going to touch machine guns on the training plan because we thought we were all good, but this exposed it. So I think that's a great link. You can't preordain what the training delta is going to be, so you have to have a leader who's dynamic enough to adapt their quarterly training program to the things that are. Unless I say a leader, this should be NCO business. This shouldn't have an officer anywhere near it, in my opinion. But that's why you also want NCOs in the war game and seeing it, and understanding and also picking out from the junior soldiers. This kid gets it. This kid is good to be an NCO in time. This kid doesn't get it. He needs to be at the back of the squad until he does get it, and so on.
All good points, and I think it is interesting you mentioned using that almost for a selection type role or an assessment type role. I think there's a lot to be said for wargaming, not just in a training context, but in a assessment selection context. I know when I was going through officer candidate school, we had almost physical jungle gym type problem solving courses we had to go through. We have instructors up on the catwalk watching us, and they're not looking for, did you solve this problem correctly? Whether that's getting 4 candidates with a barrel over a gap or something like that. It's what's the thought process? What factors are you considering? And while there's no substitute for physical stress, I think you make a great point that this is maybe not just something that could be used for training. This is also potentially a component of assessing who's getting that training in the first place.
And then the table on the right is a number of example vehicle systems. Again, you can add more or less, and you can baseline off these. You haven't necessarily defined it by unit type in here because you have the unit type cards. But you have a tank which moves 24, requires 4 persons to operate, has a tank gun with 4d10, so pretty powerful attack. Sorry, that's a defense factor. 4d10, so really powerful defense factor. And the tank gun will have its own attack value and all the rest of it printed on the card and stuff. So this is a good example of how you can baseline your thing, and you can see that the motorcycle is very likely to be destroyed, or other than small UAS and loitering munitions and so on and so forth. So very simple, scalable system using the dice as mentioned.
And it's exactly the same as kind of the general difficulty. It's intended to give people a starting point to build off from, to fit the story they're looking to tell. So I don't have a stat for 12 different types of helicopter, but pick the type that most closely resembles it, modify it, have a fist fight at the table. That's what it takes to adjudicate whose idea is correct, and then keep pushing.
Yeah, and you could. There's sort of. I'm thinking sort of back to DBA, DBM war game now with the idea of superior and inferior. So if you wanted to play that shaving the ice cube game of relative superiority, one attack helicopter could have an inherent advantage vis-a-vis another attack helicopter has, rather than changing the dice type or dice number and so on and so forth. And that would be a really simple way of making a small edge and so on and so forth. So without having to do fundamentally different rule sets.
Exactly, and I haven't really thought of it in a specific platform versus specific platform, but I know we've had several house rules come up in different games of, for example, aircraft that are in a non-contested airspace automatically have any advantage to anything on the ground. So I think that there's a lot of convergent thinking on some of these possibilities that is coming up, obviously.
Yeah. But back to your earlier point, I just love the way people are putting it in a box of, is it an advantage? Is it a disadvantage? Or is it sort of like part of the course? Rather than what a lot of, again, a lot of hobby war games can fall into this thing of like, I've worked the modifiers out, I'm on a +7, I'm all good. And it's like, that's not what happens in real war or real training, live training. You don't get to pre-calculate your chance of success. You just kind of wing it, with intuition and gut. And that's where I'm probably in the advantage territory, or I'm probably par for the course, or I'm probably disadvantage territory. I'm risking it. And I think that's a much better way to sort of quickly put things into boxes than to try and, I'll just refer to the rules, the lookup table, because Nicholas has squared this away, is the gospel of truth. And then the temptation there is to keep adding to the lookup table until you have 300 modifiers, which if they all stack, then you've got 100% chance of success. And that's not what happens.
Yeah, I really wanted to make sure there's the possibility of failure no matter what you're trying to do, no matter how much you think you stack the deck in your favor. But then also, I'm trying to leave a little bit of thinking for the players so that they're thinking through, is this an advantage? Is this a disadvantage? And I left a lot of that very abstract in the rules, because at least for professional military context, I want players to have that conversation of, does this give me an advantage or does it just make me feel better? And maybe making you feel better is an advantage. I've had a lot of people ask for morale rules, which I don't think are appropriate necessarily for this granular of a tactical level war game. But I would argue the suppression rule is just that. You may not be having a physical effect on the enemy, but you've given them a disadvantage because you're firing at them. If you want to represent a force that's with an extremely high morale in comparison to an adversary force, great. House rule, you're going to give them an advantage for the first 3 turns until reality sets in. The tools are there, I think, for players to adjudicate a lot of these situations without having to constantly come back to the rule book and hope that there's something buried on page 12, table 4 that gives them a hard and fast answer. It's giving them the tools to think for themselves in some of these questions.
Yeah. And that's perfect for a facilitator or senior person, because that discussion over advantage, disadvantage, or neutral will one, expose knowledge gaps, training gaps, biases, and also just the tactical lessons that we want to do, because the idea of being flanked is psychologically, and being enfilade fire is psychologically debilitating. Until you've had enfilade fire, you might not realize how debilitating that is. So, and that could be something that's you could then expose people to with a bit of overhead fire on one of the ranges, etc., and drive it home. These are the sort of things that you wouldn't necessarily get if the rules just gave you the answer, or again, you didn't have facing because it's a counter and it's facing 360 because it's simpler that way. So no, all good. In terms of the rules, they are not massive as far as wargame rules go. Nice big text, spaced out, double column. So contents pages goes through the core concepts, how to actually move through the actions. So attacking, medicine, damage to the environment, damage from the environment, the units and equipment details, command and signal EW, and then an in-depth example, which I love because it really does bring all the rules to life. And if you've got nothing else, just go through that. And the quick start rules, again, great, because the default setting is no one's going to read the rules. People just want to get going. Quick start rules are a great way to do that. So any sort of iterations of these rules going from, I don't know, 50 pages to 31, or feedback or choices you made in structuring it?
The first draft of the rules was about 10 pages. A lot of what I added is examples throughout the text to really clarify things that I think might not be clear to an audience when they first encounter it. Um, Things like visibility, explaining the difference between cover and concealment to an audience who may not be familiar with those concepts. The latest edition is that in-depth example of several pages that just breaks a simple scenario down from start to finish, explaining this is what's being used here. These are the mechanics in play there, and really walking people through it. That's the most recent example. I would say if I looked at the timeline of development, um, the core concepts were a later edition. Once I kind of formalized those, it was movement and action, and those chapters of you can move, you can act, and you can do both, but you can't do double of each. Um, I started with those because I felt that's kind of the core of the system. That's the heart of it. And then I expanded outward both from a perspective of what does need more mechanical detail, and then focusing on the presentation of what is going to get the training audience and the players up to speed with this quicker. The quick start rules are a little bit of a later addition. Once I realized that the core of the system was more or less fixed, I had gotten a workable system in place. And then I tried to distill everything you need to play down into a front and back of a single sheet of paper for the quick start rules. And that's everything from not pictured on the slides, for example, but on the back side of that, there's an abbreviated version of the electronic warfare rules. There's a simple table for equipment and vehicles. Um, I actually have a quicker start rules now that fits on a playing card. So if you want to have a fire team on fire team dismounted infantry engagement, you can be off to the races with a playing card. And I've kept these as the same system, not a truncated version of the system, to where if you start with the playing card quicker start rules, you can jump into a scenario with the quick start rules, and there's no mechanical difference. And then you can jump into the full rules once you've got up to speed on that, and you're not having to relearn anything or really add any rules. Um, I like to think of it as you go to the larger rule sets, what you're getting is an aid for your understanding and some tools to help you prepare a scenario, not a fundamental reshaping of how you're approaching the game, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. And I should say you've also got a website which people can access as a with specific selection settings, so you can go to various parts, which includes the units and examples of play.
Yeah, that's largely the same as the printed rules. I'm looking to make that fully public imminently. Right now, I have some sections gated off a little bit, but I'm working through kind of the final details on getting some of those approved for public release. And my intent is for the rules to live in an online form that includes some examples, includes some things that might not be appropriate for printed matter to for paper's sake. But then also a unit dictionary, to where if you're curious about, is there a unit already defined for this vehicle platform, you can look it up easily without having to clutter a printed rule book with that. And then ideally, and this is taking some technical work, I'm moving toward a solution where you can select your unit types you want a la carte, and you can not only download potentially the 3D model files, but the reference cards for the unit that tell you the statistics for the whole thing, their weapon system, all that, in a form that is ready to print, cut, and play with, without having to do that finagling of what you're going to print and wastage and all that. No, it gives you a package like we've been sending out to units, tailor-made for your needs without any further manual intervention.
That's brilliant. That's the toy designer coming through and you just making it easy. And in all seriousness, this is a great point that people want an easy button. You know, time is precious in the 21st century. Everyone else is making things easy and intuitive, and the military wants you to do a 55-step process through a clunky graphical user interface. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. Make it easy for people. Make it so the Lance Corporal can do this, not that it requires the captain to go through the gateway to the the example of TRADOC, whatever, to then request it and get a return and do a justification and blah 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 blah. Which is where a lot of these things have gone wrong in the past because we followed a process mindset.
All good points. And I am working on a couple other training aids for this. One of the things that I've started up very recently actually is because I've gotten a lot of inquiries from allied forces out there that I don't speak the language of. I don't have a staff of professional translators as much as I would, and I don't have the resources to put into hiring them. One of the things I'm working on is a variant of the quick start rules that is text free. Um, that doesn't necessarily get into all the nitty gritty, but lets you hand a card to someone who may not even be literate. They can understand the rules and they can start to play and be part of that conversation. Um, I can see different applications for that in wargaming as a part of training partner forces. Also, just to get it out there as an interim solution while I work on translations of the game as well. Um, as wonderful as it would be for me to have every language in the world represented for everyone to enjoy the game, it's probably not feasible in the near term, but I am looking at a couple translations for uh, organizations and units that have expressed some particular interest in this.
Mm. Yeah, the training partner forces aspect, I think it's great because and language training in the context of the role you need it to fulfill. So rather than doing a lot of language training about where the library or the bank is and third road on the right, you can be talking in a language of more I need the machine gunner on the hill facing north now, which again the grammar, the tense that you use for that, and again, you actually have a narrower field of phrases you need in the military when you learn a language versus the full gamut you need for civilian conversation, which is often one of the things that gets taught first, and then you try and learn the military stuff when you train together, and that can be problematic. So yeah, I think it's great, and we've all had the examples of the foreign attached person sitting politely in the room, listening to a PowerPoint brief, understanding very little, but not saying anything. You can very quickly, and you therefore, you might think they don't know anything because they're not contributing, and they know a lot. They might have great views on tactics or whatever that can come out in the game by showing you, and then you can be like, oh, what you're doing there, that's echeloning fires or whatever, and he's like, oh yeah, we say this or whatever. No, so again, I haven't got examples of this, but I think it's a great, it's the equivalent of breaking bread with somebody, but the tactical equivalent in the sandpit, and you're all focused on the miniatures and the scenario, and you're not like cross briefing or it's not adversarial in the sense of you're not standing up in front of the class and giving a presentation and you're going to fear saying the wrong thing or not being understood. So I think it's great. You're talking past the problem rather than you are talking at each other as problems.
That's actually a use case I haven't considered, is using it for language familiarization. But that's actually a very good idea. I'll have to look into and reach out to some folks about whether they want to use it for that. Because, like you said, it's a very constrained vocabulary people need to use in a professional situation like that. And being able to say machine gun here 5 minutes from now, you don't need the grammar necessarily, but the vocabulary, like this. Yeah, I could see this being a very good training tool. Wargaming in general being a great training tool for that type of communication.
Yeah. Philippine Marines, let's get it going. I love it. So you've also included a unit guide at the back, which is obviously Pacific orientated. That would make a lot of sense. And you've spoken about the Chinese and US Marines previously in this talk, but you've also added on the website, these are links, as in these cards have been taken from the website link. You've got the US Army and you've got Russia, which I think is great because again, this is applicable to more than one theater. And this also allows other land-based forces, infantry-based forces, mechanized-based forces to use without the sort of, again, the classic whinge, oh, the war game doesn't work because it's got Chinese instead of Russians in it, which functionally is not a critique, but it's the sort of thing you get from a senior officer, from a G2 person who says this war game is inaccurate because it's a BMP1, not a BMP2, as opposed to like, are we doing the drills right, etc.
Yeah, and there's this is also, I think, me learning from the vehicle recognition piece of things, where I realize that there is value in having some of these different platforms represented. For example, I not pictured on the slides, but there's a base model T80. I've broken out some of the BMP variants now a little bit more. I've got different variants of, say, the Bradley, the Stryker, and all that. And that's not just for vehicle recognition, but I do think it is, as much as it is for practical purpose, it is also to overcome the reaction that you say of, well, it doesn't have this platform in it, so we can't use it. It is a little bit of sugar to make the pill go down a little bit better for some of the senior officers who might want their platform of choice represented in the rule set. I do like to reuse as much as possible, both from a manufacturing standpoint and from a mechanical standpoint for these. I like to joke that in adding the Ukrainian models, I'm just taking every other force and including their hardware with a new coat of paint. Really saves the modeling, but I think it reflects the diversity of platforms and operation there. So as I go along, I'm finding it is becoming much quicker to add new vehicles, new types of equipment, both as I get more fluent with the process and automate a lot of it, but also from being able to build on existing models and existing mechanical structures that I have in place for other forces.
Yeah, so if you are US Army and you're watching this, then you can reach out and get on board the downrange gravy train. So playtesting and reception, we've had a lot of this as we've gone through, but there's some stock photos of it, and it also hit the military news website. Not sure I necessarily like the term nerds with a drive for violence, but I think these stereotypes just need to be just met and defeated in the face. So, yeah, fine. I'm practicing my craft. Like it's a non-story. I mean, it's a good story. There's a lot of credit and positive messaging in it. Sometimes the headlines can be used as a bit clickbaity.
So as a former, perhaps current, we'll see where my career goes, public affairs officer, I've learned that sometimes there is value in having something that's a little bit splashier, that's a little bit maybe not controversial, but will drive a question of what do they mean by that to drive engagement. But this is also a very deliberate attempt to, I believe that's a direct quote from me, that term. That is also a deliberate cultural influence attempt, I guess you could say, at dispelling the idea that, being a United States Marine and wanting to go out there and be aggressive, and then being someone who likes rolling dice and playing with little toy figures to, for entertainment, those are by no means mutually exclusive. Um, and also to just kind of drive home that you can be playing and still training. You can be playing, you can be training, and still coupling that with an understanding at the end of the day, the business at hand you're training for is violence. I think that's important to not lose sight of. And even with some of the less abstract models and tokens and mechanics that this system has compared to larger systems, I do think it is important for people playing this to understand that what they're simulating is an inherently violent process with a real human cost. And like you mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of room for augments to the system. There are non-standard house rules to try to drive that home and make sure people understand that, especially in a professional audience, it is a roll of the dice metaphorically, but the currency you're spending is human life, and that's something you should not spend unwisely. Which is, at the end of the day, I guess the goal of all training that we do in a military context.
Yeah, and you've sort of succinctly got us to the point of that all war games really are decision adjudication feedback loops. Players make decisions, stuff happens in front of them, they make new decisions. And the losing half your squad because of a bad decision can be quite a terrible feeling. Well, it's a horrendous feeling in real life. It's less of a horrendous feeling in a war game, but the lesson is no less transmitted. And I think that's the kind of point about, it's not the fact that they were 3D printed figures and the blood splodges look a bit childish. It was the fact that that commander leader is now tracking that their decision making has led to the death of or injury of half their squad, and they should probably look to work on that before they have to do it again for real. Which and if a 45-minute PowerPoint lesson has never done that ever and never will. So I think this in itself is better than a lot of the time spent in barracks doing the mandated training on whatever subject.
I think we're definitely in wholehearted agreement on that point. I would also like to bring up that I think it's a shame that wargaming is called what it is to an extent, because I think there's a lot of potential for a lot of that same decision feedback loop you mentioned for not just maybe non-kinetic operations, but for non-military operations as well. I actually had a gentleman from the Red Cross reach out to me about the system and looking to kind of discuss how they can integrate wargaming to some of their planning. Because when you're looking from a planning perspective, allocating, I want this weapon system at this location, and I have to plan it ahead. So I'm going to pack this many weapon systems on this platform and take it to this theater. That is not a dissimilar process to allocating relief supplies. The process of allocating a limited number of, say, medical manpower folks to relief organizations and all that. That's not dissimilar to allocating critical specialties in a military context. I think there's a lot of room to open the aperture a little bit and adapt military-focused war games to non-military objectives, but at the same time to take stuff from outside the military and bring it into the military wargaming space. There's, I would say, if anything, the influences that I draw on in some of the other war games I've developed are almost exclusively games that are not focused on conflict. I think there is a lot of value that is often left on the table in commercial military wargaming in not looking outside the conflict bubble and not realizing that there are some other mechanics out there and some other concepts out there that might be useful. And especially when we get to things like electronic warfare, especially cyber effects too. I'm a wholehearted proponent of the idea that as planners and practitioners, we really need to break our addiction to geography. Because when you're trying to depict the human terrain of an area or the network topology of an area, um, I always get senior leaders saying, "Can you put that on a map? What does this look like overlaid on the physical geography?" Which is it's valuable, it's got its place, but that may not be the most effective way to understand that terrain. Just like you say, a PowerPoint is not the most effective way to understand the decision process involved. Maybe a war game is more appropriate for both those domains.
Yeah. Speaking the language of role play, as in immersive role play, if you are the tribal leader in this situation, what are you doing? As opposed to what do we think the tribal leader is going to do? And according to our biases, our Western education and our culture, it's very, very different. And you still won't get all the way there with the role play, but you'll get further there than sitting back and admiring it through the lens of your from our Judeo-Christian Western privilege sort of, I could go on, but that's where role play is really, really good, and forcing people to make decisions. One question I was going to ask on this, have you thought about using it for tactical decision exercises? So at the scale appropriate, so clearly not battalion or maybe, but the smaller ones, you can actually put it out and say, do the whole TDE process. I'm not suggesting you circumvent that, but you can then go, fine, we've listened to various back briefs and critiqued and discussed. We're now going to do a COA.
Yes, that's a big part of what we've actually seen people using it for is tactical decision games, and we've seen it used for orders development education a lot, especially where people will come up with their order in the traditional process of doing a sand table game, and then that platoon commander is giving the order he develops to squad leaders that then play the war game based on that order. Um, that's very effective, especially in a double blind scenario where the role of intelligence and using some unmanned systems to gather information is a little bit more feasible. But that's absolutely part of what this is used for, and in many senses, what it's developed for from the start is facilitating that type of tactical decision game and that type of training.
Okay, that's great. Well, Nicholas, thanks for coming on. Do you have any advice for anyone looking to do this, not specifically this, but a war game in their own institution? 60 seconds of wisdom, please.
Hitting my earlier topic, look outside your bubble. If you're in the military, look outside the military bubble and see what you can bring in from games that are on the table. Don't be afraid to take something that might on the surface look completely different from what you're trying to simulate and adapt that to your purposes. Always start from the perspective of what conversations, I like to frame it as arguments, but what argument do you want the players to have? Center everything on that and discard the rest. You don't need to have your war game do everything. Your war game is the framework for that discussion, and you can augment that discussion with all your existing planning products, all your existing processes. The war game just needs to be that driver to present people with decisions, to foster discussion, and to spark some arguments that are going to drive the objective forward. And really at the end of the day, that's my process in a nutshell: is look at what you can bring in, and look at what you're going to bring in and how that drives the arguments you want people to have. So at the end of the day, they come out of that argument having learned something.
That is superb advice. So if you're watching, write that down, because you will be tempted by scope creep and adding Chrome and stuff. And I am a guilty sinner of this on several war games that I'm on. And the thing just starts to seize up like a machine with no oil in the gears. So yeah, as Nicholas said, keep it simple. The imagination will add the flavor, which your rules do not. So Nicholas, thanks again for coming on. Appreciate everything you're doing. All the best wishes for downrange and rolling this out. And I hope many more stakeholder organizations will pick it up, run with it, and build upon it to increase the level of wargaming and the frequency of wargaming in the force.
Absolutely. I think that can only make us better. And I really appreciate you having me on. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Cheers. Thanks, buddy.